When my mom whispered, "Turn off the alerts," I thought she meant my phone. But she was trembling, eyes darting toward the living room where my stepfather paced. Drunk again. 3 hours later, she was gone, and I had bruises I couldn't explain away. 2 years later, the clip from 4:03 a.m., the one I never knew existed, started playing in the middle of a corporate Zoom call. That was when my revenge began. My name is Claire Nolan, and I was 32 the night my world was reduced to the sound of shattering glass and a whisper. I came home just after 3 in the morning, the exhaustion from my nursing shift a heavy cloak on my shoulders. The streets were slick with a fine mist, the city lights bleeding into watercolor streaks on my windshield. All I wanted was the silence of my room and the oblivion of sleep. But silence was a luxury our house no longer afforded. The moment I pushed the door open, the smell hit me, a sour, aggressive mix of spilled whiskey and the cheap pine cleaner Mom used to erase the evidence. The air was thick with a tension so palpable it felt like walking through water. In the harsh fluorescent glare of the kitchen, I saw her, my mother, Ellen, on her knees, a small dustpan and brush in her trembling hands. Shards of a whiskey tumbler, one of the heavy ones he favored, glittered on the linoleum like fallen stars. She didn't look up, but her entire body was coiled tight, a study in quiet terror. Her shoulders were hunched, her movements small and precise, as if a single loud scrape of the brush against the floor could trigger an explosion. From the living room, his voice came, a booming, slurred roar that rattled the cheap prints on the walls. "I know you took it. Ellen, think I'm a damn fool." Rick Nolan, my stepfather, the man whose name I had been forced to share for a decade, a name that felt like acid on my tongue. He was a mountain of a man, made larger by rage and cheap liquor. His accusations were the soundtrack to our lives, a constant, looping track of paranoia and blame. Tonight's theme was the savings account, a small fund my mother had painstakingly built from her part-time job at the library, her escape money. She'd once whispered to me with a fragile smile. My mother flinched at the sound of his voice. She finally looked at me, her eyes wide and pleading. They were the same deep blue as mine, but hers were clouded with a fear I knew too well. She put a finger to her lips, then pointed toward my pocket, where my phone was. "Claire, honey," she mouthed, the words a silent prayer. "Turn off the alerts, please, the sounds." She didn't need to finish. I understood. In Rick's alcohol-soaked mind, every ping, every buzz, every notification was a secret communication, a conspiracy against him. A text from a friend was a lover. A news alert was the police closing in. My hand was already in my pocket, thumb swiping the screen into silent mode. It was a familiar, reflexive action, a survival mechanism honed over years of living with a ghost that roared. I nodded, trying to give her a reassuring look I didn't feel. She gave a weak, grateful nod in return before her attention snapped back to the glass, her hands moving faster now. I slipped past the kitchen, down the short hallway to my bedroom, my shoes sticking slightly to a damp spot on the floor I didn't want to identify. I closed my door, the click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the charged silence. I leaned against the wood, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could still hear his voice, lower now, a menacing rumble. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, venomous, accusatory. It was always the same cycle: the drinking, the paranoia, the rage, followed by my mother's frantic, silent efforts to de-escalate, to become smaller, quieter, to vanish into the wallpaper until the storm passed. I sank onto my bed, the exhaustion I'd felt moments before replaced by a sharp, acidic adrenaline. I didn't bother changing out of my scrubs. I just sat there, listening, every muscle tensed. This was the worst part: the waiting for the shouting to fade, for the sound of the television to click on, for the heavy, stumbling footsteps to finally recede toward their bedroom. Tonight, it felt different. The anger wasn't subsiding, it was simmering, building. Then, I heard it, a sound that cut through the rumbling monologue. It wasn't the crash of glass this time. It was a dull, heavy thud, a sickening impact, like a sack of flour being dropped from a height. The sound of something solid hitting the drywall. Hard. It was followed by a silence that was somehow louder and more terrifying than the yelling had been. A dead, breathless void. And then the scream. It wasn't a long, piercing shriek. It was a sharp, choked cry of pain and surprise. Swallowed almost as soon as it began. My mother's voice. I was moving before I even made a conscious decision. My body acting on pure, instinctual dread. I threw my door open and sprinted down the hallway. The scene that met me in the living room is seared into my memory like a flashbulb photograph. My mother was on the floor, crumpled at the base of the wall, her hand outstretched. Rick stood over her, his face a mask of purple rage, his chest heaving. He turned as I entered, his eyes, bloodshot and wild, locking onto mine. "You," he spat, the word dripping with irrational hatred. I didn't have time to speak, to scream, to think. He lunged, not like a man, but like an animal. He was a blur of plaid shirt and denim. I raised my hands instinctively, a useless gesture. He didn't hit me with his fist. He used his whole body, a brutal shove with the full force of his 250 pounds. My feet left the floor. For a split second, I was airborne, suspended in a moment of shocked disbelief. Then the world exploded in a starburst of white pain as the side of my head and face slammed into the wall. I felt a sickening, grating crack, a sound that seemed to come from inside my own skull. The rough texture of the plaster scraped against my cheek, and a searing heat radiated from the point of impact. I slid down the wall, landing in a heap on the carpet, the room tilting violently. A metallic taste, warm and coppery, filled my mouth. Through the ringing in my ears, I could hear him breathing, ragged and heavy, like a bull after a charge. Dimly, I was aware of flashing lights, red and blue, painting the walls through the front window. A neighbor must have finally called. The sound of a siren grew from a distant wail to a piercing shriek that seemed to drill directly into my fractured head. When the 2 police officers came through the door, Rick had transformed. The wild animal was gone. In his place stood a concerned, grieving husband, his hands held up in a gesture of helplessness. He was pointing at my mother, who hadn't moved. "She fell," he said, his voice miraculously steady, laced with a practiced, convincing sorrow. "We were arguing. She tripped and fell, hit her head." He then gestured to me, a flicker of something cold in his eyes. My daughter ran in, slipped on the spilled drink, hit the wall herself. It all happened so fast. The lie was so simple, so audacious, yet delivered with the conviction of a poet. The paramedics came in, a whirlwind of calm, professional motion. One came to me, shining a penlight in my eyes that made me recoil in pain. "You're going to need stitches," he said, his voice muffled, and a scan. But my eyes were on the other team, the ones surrounding my mother. They were working on her, quiet and urgent. I saw the defibrillator paddles. I heard the clipped, emotionless jargon. And then, I saw the lead paramedic stop, straighten up, and shake his head at his partner. In that moment, the world stopped moving. The ringing in my ears faded to a dull roar. They were placing a white sheet over her body, over her face. I was taken to the hospital in a haze of pain and disbelief. They stitched the gash on my cheek, the needle pulling the skin together in a tight, angry line. They told me I had a severe concussion and a fractured cheekbone. A detective came to my room. He was a tired-looking man with a cheap suit and coffee stains on his tie. He asked me what happened, his pen hovering over a notepad. Through a swollen jaw and a throat tight with unshed tears, I told him everything. I told him about the yelling, the broken glass, the thud, the scream. I told him how Rick threw me against the wall. He listened, his expression unchanging. When I was finished, he asked, "So you didn't actually see him strike your mother?" I heard it. I rasped. I heard her scream. He was standing over her. "But you didn't see it," he repeated, not as a question, but as a statement. "Mr. Nolan says she fell. Your own injuries are consistent with a fall. There are no cameras in the house, no other witnesses. It's a classic, he said, she said, situation. He said it with a sigh, as if my trauma was a tedious inconvenience. Another messy domestic dispute in a long line of them. My word. The word of a concussed, grieving daughter, against the word of a calm, sobered-up husband. 2 days later, while I was still numb, still trying to process a world that no longer contained my mother, the detective called. His voice was flat, bureaucratic. The coroner's report came back. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a fall. Given the lack of conclusive evidence or witnesses, we're ruling it a domestic accident. The case is closed. Case closed. 3 words that erased my mother's life. 3 words that validated his lie. 3 words that let a monster walk free. I hung up the phone. I walked into the bathroom and stared at my reflection. My left eye was a swollen, purple ruin. A neat line of black stitches traced a jagged path down my cheek, a permanent reminder of that night. They told me it would leave a scar. In the sterile silence of that hospital room, looking at the evidence of his violence etched onto my own face, I made a vow. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a cold, quiet promise that settled deep in my bones. A piece of ice forming around my heart. The law had failed. The system had failed. The world had looked away. Fine. If the law wouldn't bring him to justice, I would. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I knew that my life now had a singular purpose. I would be the evidence. I would be the witness. And I would be the verdict. 2 years. 730 days. It's a length of time that sounds significant. But for me, it was merely a change of scenery for the same recurring nightmare. The new scenery was the sterile, glass-walled office of Brightspan Technologies in San Jose, California. I had crossed 3 states, shed the name Nolan like a snake sheds its skin, and reinvented myself as Claire Evans. Here, I was just another face in the sea of ambitious tech professionals, a quiet woman with a knack for data analysis and a past as blank as a newly formatted hard drive. Brightspan was at the bleeding edge of data security, a fortress of code and encryption that promised its high-profile clients absolute peace of mind. Our headquarters was a monument to modern corporate aesthetics, open-plan layouts, designed to foster a synergistic workflow, polished concrete floors, and an ever-present, low hum from the server rooms that sounded like the building's own heartbeat. The air was a carefully controlled 72 degrees and smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and the burnt coffee from the communal kitchen. It was a place of manufactured calm, a world away from the suffocating chaos of my previous life. No one here knew who Claire Nolan was. No one knew the story behind the faint, silvery scar that traced my left cheekbone, a detail I'd learned to obscure with carefully applied concealer. In this new life, I did not have a mother who died on her living room floor. I did not have a stepfather. I had no family to speak of. A convenient fiction that preempted any prying questions. I was a ghost, a carefully constructed identity with a plausible but thin backstory about growing up in Oregon. This carefully built facade, however, was fragile. It could be shattered by something as simple as a vibration. 2 years on, the phantom buzz of a phone could still send a jolt of ice through my veins. I kept my phone on my desk, face down, always on silent, but in meetings, when a dozen other phones lay on the polished boardroom table, one would inevitably buzz. The sound, innocuous to everyone else, would instantly transport me. My breath would catch. My pulse would skyrocket, and for a split second, I would be back in that hallway, listening to my mother's desperate, silent plea, turn off the alerts. The boardroom's soft lighting would feel harsh and interrogative, and the faces of my colleagues would blur into indistinct shapes. I would have to physically grip the edge of the table, my knuckles white, to anchor myself in the present, to stop myself from running. My immediate superior was Mark Willen, the director of data integrity. He was everything I was not: loud, effortlessly confident, and performatively charismatic. He wore $1,000 sneakers with his tailored slacks and spoke in a rapid-fire cadence of buzzwords and corporate acronyms. He saw me as a reliable, if uninteresting, cog in his machine. He'd taken to calling me Quiet Claire, often with a condescending pat on the shoulder. Great work on the Peterson account. Quiet Claire, he'd say, not waiting for a response. Let's circle back on the Q3 projections. I'll need your analytics by EOD. He never looked me in the eye for more than a second. To him, I was an algorithm, a function that processed data and produced results. My silence and efficiency were assets, but my lack of enthusiastic participation in his thought showers and team-building happy hours made me an enigma he had no interest in solving. He preferred people who mirrored his own volume. My quiet was a void he couldn't fill with his own voice, and so he simply ignored it. The universe, in its cruel and twisted sense of humor, had placed me in the one department that served as a constant, grinding reminder of the night that destroyed my life. I was a senior analyst in the Secure Surveillance Division. My job, my entire professional existence, revolved around analyzing security camera footage for our clients. I parsed terabytes of video data, looking for glitches, anomalies, and signs of tampering. It was a bitter, biting irony that I was paid, and paid very well, to find the truth in video recordings, the very thing I had desperately needed and been denied. I was exceptionally good at my job. My focus was absolute, my attention to detail pathological. I could spot a single frame of corrupted data in hours of footage, a subtle shift in lighting that indicated a doctored timeline, a pixelated anomaly that revealed a hidden edit. My colleagues saw it as a gift. I knew it was a curse. My skill wasn't born from talent. It was forged in the obsessive furnace of my grief. Every file I opened was a ghost of what I didn't have. Every clear, time-stamped recording of a crime or an accident was a testament to a truth that was recorded, preserved, and validated. A truth my mother was never given. Sometimes, a client's file would come through with a segment missing, a corrupted clip, showing nothing but a black screen with the timestamp running over it. 4:03 a.m., 4:04 a.m., 4:05 a.m., a void, a black hole in the record. In those moments, I would stare at the screen, my hands frozen over the keyboard. The professional detachment would crumble, and I would be Claire Nolan again, the girl who was told there was no proof. My sterile office would dissolve, and I'd be back in that house, staring at a blank space where justice should have been. The black screen on my monitor was the closed case file, the shrug of the detective, the final, unforgivable silence. This internal torment did not go entirely unnoticed. My professional mask was nearly perfect, but the cracks were beginning to show. My refusal to engage in office pleasantries, my laser focus that bordered on antisocial, had been flagged. I was summoned for a meeting with a woman from Human Resources named Jessica, whose smile was as bright and artificial as the succulents on her desk. "Claire," she began, her voice a gentle, practiced purr, "your performance reviews are outstanding. Truly, Mark is very impressed with your technical skills." She paused, steepling her fingers. "However, there is some feedback about your overall disposition, a feeling that you're not fully integrated with the team culture. We value positivity here at Brightspan. It's one of our core pillars." She pushed a brochure across the desk. It was for a mindfulness workshop. "We just want to make sure you're feeling supported," she continued, her smile never wavering. "The suggestion is for you to try and maintain a more positive attitude. Maybe join the Friday social committee." I took the brochure, the glossy paper feeling slick and alien in my hand. I produced a smile of my own, a hollow, brittle thing I had practiced in the mirror. "Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate the feedback. I'll work on it." She beamed, satisfied that her corporate duty was done. I was dismissed, a problem neatly addressed with a pamphlet and a platitude. I walked back to my desk and dropped the brochure directly into the recycling bin. I sat through the rest of the day's meetings, the fake smile plastered on my face. I nodded along as Mark Willen outlined his vision for the next quarter, his voice a confident drone that filled every corner of the room. He clicked through slides filled with upward trending graphs and inspiring stock photos of diverse, smiling professionals, I looked engaged. I made the occasional note in my leather-bound notebook, but inside my head, there was only one sound, one memory playing on a relentless loop. My mother's face, pale and terrified in the kitchen light. Her whisper, a ghost on the air. Turn off alerts. I was trapped in that memory, a prisoner in the cold, quiet fortress of my mind. I believed this was my life now, an endless cycle of repressed trauma and professional excellence, a quiet purgatory of my own making. I had no idea that my mother's final words, the very source of my recurring pain, were not just a memory but a key. I didn't know that they were about to unlock a door I never knew existed, in a place I never would have looked. The system I worked within, the impenetrable digital fortress of Brightspan Technologies, was perfect. It was seamless, secure, and infallible, or so they claimed, but I, better than anyone, knew that nothing is ever truly perfect. Every system has a flaw, every code has a bug, every fortress has a crack, and a hidden, unnoticed flaw in Brightspan's own servers was about to become the weapon I never knew I was waiting for. It was a Thursday night, just past 10. The office, once a bustling hive of activity, had emptied out, leaving behind a profound and welcome silence. Only the whisper of the HVAC system and the quiet, rhythmic hum of the servers in their chilled rooms remained. I often stayed late. The long hours were a shield, a way to fill the empty space that yawned open after work. And the sterile quiet of the building was a balm on my frayed nerves. I was running a routine diagnostic, a data integrity sweep across our secondary staging servers. It was tedious, monotonous work, the digital equivalent of checking for leaky pipes in a vast, complex plumbing system. I was scrolling through endless directories of log files, my eyes scanning for any anomaly, any transfer packet that didn't align with protocol. Most of the files were gibberish to an outsider, strings of alphanumeric code, temporary cache files, and system logs with names like syslog 20510072100. Dat, my brain, trained for this, filtered it all as background noise, until it didn't. One file, nestled deep within a legacy backup folder scheduled for purging, broke the pattern. It wasn't the file type, an MP4 was common enough, but the naming convention. It was user-generated, not system-generated. It had a date, a descriptor, and a time. The name itself felt like a whisper in the silent code. 418 SAM, backup 4:03 AM, MP4. I paused, my fingers hovering over the mouse. My first thought was that it was a sloppy remnant from a developer's test, a file that had slipped through the cracks of the last system cleanup. Someone had likely been testing a camera backup function and had forgotten to delete the output. Annoying, but not unusual. Still, something about the name prickled at the back of my mind. The date, 04/19, April 18th. A cold, slow wave of dread began to rise from the pit of my stomach. April 18th was a meaningless date to Claire Evans, but to Claire Nolan, it was an anniversary. The date was seared into my soul. It was the day my mother died. My heart began a low, heavy drum against my ribs. Coincidence. I told myself, it's just a coincidence. There are only 365 days in a year. But then my eyes drifted to the end of the file name, 4:03 AM, 4:03 in the morning, the approximate time I had gotten home that night, the time everything began to unravel. My breath hitched, my clinical detachment, the carefully constructed wall between my past and my present, began to crumble. My training took over. A desperate attempt to impose logic on a situation that was rapidly spiraling into the surreal. I right-clicked the file, my hand unsteady. I didn't open it, not yet. I selected Properties and navigated to the Metadata tab. I needed to see the source. I needed to see the developer's IP address, the internal server it originated from, the rational explanation. The metadata window populated. My eyes scanned the lines of technical information: file size, 12.4 MB, encoding format, H.264, audio codec, AAC, standard, Then I saw the GPS and location data fields. My blood ran cold. It wasn't an IP address. It wasn't a server location in our San Jose campus. It was a street address. 1138, Oak Street, Cleveland, Ohio. I stopped breathing. The characters on the screen seemed to warp and shimmer. The fluorescent lights of the office suddenly blinding. It couldn't be. It was impossible. 1138, Oak Street, the house I grew up in. The house where I'd left my mother for the last time. The house I had sold 2 months after the funeral, vowing never to set foot in that state again. For a long moment, I could do nothing but stare. The quiet hum of the servers seemed to grow into a deafening roar. The world narrowed to the small, glowing box on my screen, containing the address of my own personal hell. Why was a file stamped with that place, that time, sitting on a Brightspan server in California? My gaze drifted down to the next line of metadata, the one I had subconsciously avoided. Uploader. The field was supposed to contain a system ID or a corporate client account number, but this one contained a name. 2 words that shattered the last vestiges of my composure. Nolan. The air punched out of my lungs in a silent gasp. I physically recoiled, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. Nolan. Nolan. Rick. It was him. The monster from my past had reached across 2,000 miles and 2 years of carefully constructed anonymity and found me. He had left a digital footprint inside my sanctuary. My hands began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. I clasped them together, trying to force them still, but it was useless. 1,000 frantic questions exploded in my mind. How did he get access? Was he a client? How could a personal file from a non-client end up on a secure internal server? The implications were staggering. He had used our service. He had paid my employer, the very company that provided my escape, to store this thing. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was almost as shocking as the discovery itself. He had hidden his secret in the last place anyone would ever think to look, in a digital fortress he believed was impenetrable, unknowingly putting it right at my fingertips. I felt a surge of nausea, but I fought it down. The analyst in me, the survivor, clawed its way back to the surface through the tidal wave of shock and fear. I had to see it. I had to know what was on it. My shaking hand guided the mouse cursor until it hovered over the file name. The double click was the loudest sound I had ever heard. My laptop's media player launched, a black rectangle appearing in the center of my screen. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was nothing, just a black, empty void. I thought the file was corrupted, a final, cruel joke. And then, the audio faded in. It was muffled, distorted, as if recorded from inside a pocket or a bag. There was the sound of movement, the faint rustle of fabric, and then there was a voice, her voice, my mother's voice. It was thin, frayed with terror, and so achingly familiar it felt like a physical blow. Turn off the alerts. The words I had heard 1,000 times in my nightmares, now real, tangible, and emanating from the speakers of my company-issued laptop. They were followed by a muffled sound, and then my own voice, distant and tinny. Okay, Mom, it's off. I slammed the laptop shut with a violent crack. My chair flew backwards as I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving. I stumbled to the other side of my cubicle, pressing my back against the cool partition, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The ghost had spoken. For 2 years. That memory had been mine alone, a subjective, traumatic echo that the police had dismissed. But it wasn't just a memory anymore. It was data. It was proof. The panic subsided, replaced by a chilling, razor-sharp clarity. I was no longer the victim. I was the custodian of the truth. I walked back to the desk, my movements deliberate, my hands miraculously steady now. The tremor was gone, replaced by a cold, burning purpose. I opened the laptop. The black screen of the media player was still there. I didn't hit play again. I didn't need to. I knew what I had. He could delete it. A system purge could wipe it. I couldn't leave it here. Protocol demanded I report the anomaly to Mark Willen. I imagined the conversation, the corporate investigation, the risk assessment meetings. They would see it as a data breach, a liability. They would protect the client. They would protect the company. They would bury it, just like the police did. The system, whether legal or corporate, was designed to protect itself. It was never designed to protect my mother. I slid a small, encrypted flash drive from my bag, one I used for personal security. I plugged it into the USB port. My fingers flew across the keyboard, partitioning a section of the drive, creating a triple encrypted container. The process was automatic. Muscle memory. I dragged the file, 0418, CAM backup 403 AM, MP4, into the container. The progress bar for the transfer appeared, a thin blue line crawling across the screen. It was only 12 megabytes, but it felt like I was moving a mountain. It felt like I was stealing fire from the gods. When the transfer was complete, I ejected the drive and closed all the windows, meticulously clearing my activity logs for the last hour, routing my commands through a series of proxies to mask my digital footprints, a ghost in the machine. I held the small, cool metal drive in the palm of my hand. It felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the truth of my mother's last moments. This wasn't a corporate file anymore. It wasn't evidence for a police force that had already failed me. It was something more. It was a tool, a weapon, a piece of divine intervention delivered to me by the sheer, blind arrogance of the man who thought he had gotten away with murder. I would not report it. I would not hand it over. I would hold on to it, study it, and when the time was right, I would use it, not to seek justice from a broken system, but to wreak a terrible and precise vengeance of my own design. The encrypted flash drive in my pocket was a cold, hard secret. It changed everything. The next morning, as I walked through the gleaming glass doors of Brightspan Technologies, the building no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like an extension of the crime scene, the manufactured calm, the pleasant hum of the servers, the air of impregnable security. It was all a lie. My mother's ghost was in this machine, and I was the only one who could hear her. My mission had shifted from mere survival to infiltration. I had to understand how the system that was supposed to be my sanctuary had become his vault. My work became a cover for my obsession. During the day, I was quiet Claire Evans, the efficient analyst, running diagnostics and submitting reports. But every query I ran, every line of code I reviewed, was a feint. My real search was for a ghost named R. Nolan. I started with the main client database, a sprawling repository of every standard account holder. I ran the search under the guise of checking for duplicate account entries, a plausible, mundane task. My heart hammered as I typed his name. The search returned 0 results. He wasn't a standard client. Of course, he wasn't. That would have been too simple. This meant he was something else, something more protected. Brightspan, like any corporation catering to the wealthy and powerful, had tiers. There was the public-facing product, and then there was the bespoke, white-glove service for the clientele they truly valued. I navigated to the directory for our premium services division, a corner of the network with access so restricted that most employees didn't even know it existed. My senior analyst credentials gave me read-only access, a privilege granted to a select few for high-level troubleshooting, a digital key to the executive suite. I ran the search again. This time, a single entry appeared. Nolan, Richard, account type VIP Gold, status active. A wave of cold fury washed over me. VIP, a very important person. He had a designation, a label that afforded him a level of service and discretion that was, by its very nature, a shield. I clicked on the profile. Most of the data was heavily redacted, even from my view, but I could see his account manager. The name made the bile rise in my throat. Mark Willen. My boss, the man who called me Quiet Claire and patted me on the shoulder, the purveyor of corporate synergy and team-building platitudes, was the personal gatekeeper for the man who had destroyed my life. The connection wasn't a coincidence. It was a conspiracy. But I needed more than a connection. I needed a motive. Why would Willen risk his career and the company's reputation to harbor a client's dirty little secret on an internal server? The answer, as it always is in these circles, had to be money. I shifted my hunt from client databases to internal financials, a far more dangerous territory. I started digging into departmental budgets and discretionary spending accounts under the pretense of a cross-departmental efficiency analysis, a self-initiated project that would earn me praise for my proactive attitude if anyone asked. I focused on Willen's department, data integrity. I sifted through expense reports, vendor contracts, and travel reimbursements, looking for anything out of the ordinary. It was a digital needle in a haystack. After 3 late nights fueled by bitter coffee and cold rage, I found it. It was a line item in an old budget proposal for something called the Brightspan Forward Foundation. On the surface, it was a generic corporate charity fund, designed for community outreach and sponsoring STEM scholarships. It was managed by a small internal committee, chaired by none other than Mark Willen. I managed to unearth a list of the foundation's private donors, the benefactors whose generosity bought them goodwill and, I suspected, much more. And there, halfway down the list, was his name, Richard Nolan. $50,000 donation. The date of the donation was 6 weeks after my mother's death. It wasn't a donation, it was a payment, blood money, laundered through a corporate charity, paid to the man who controlled the digital locks and keys. Willen hadn't just received the money, he had solicited it. He was complicit. Now I had to test the lock. I couldn't confront him directly. He would shut me down, erase the evidence, and have me fired before I could even log into my workstation. I needed to approach him from an angle. The next day, I requested a brief meeting, citing a potential security vulnerability I had theorized. We sat in his glass-walled office, the picture of a diligent employee and her supportive manager. I laid out a hypothetical scenario, my voice carefully measured and professional. Mark, I was running some deep-level diagnostics, and I identified a potential loophole in the legacy server architecture. It's theoretically possible for a client-side upload to be misrouted during a server handshake and end up cached in a temporary internal directory, bypassing standard client-side encryption protocols. It could expose the company to significant liability if sensitive, non-contractual data were to be stored there unknowingly. I watched his face for a reaction, for a flicker of recognition, a flash of fear. Nothing. His expression was a mask of bored concentration. He steepled his fingers, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. "Is this a confirmed breach, Claire?" he asked, his tone flat. "No. Just a structural vulnerability I think we should proactively address," I replied. He waved a dismissive hand. "The legacy servers are being decommissioned in 2 quarters. Engineering is aware of their limitations. It's a non-issue." He glanced at the clock on his screen. "Focus on the Q4 audit prep. This isn't your concern." Not your concern. The same cold, bureaucratic dismissal I had received from the police. It was the unofficial motto of a system designed to protect itself. The door slammed shut. He was stonewalling me. He knew. He absolutely knew. And he had just warned me to back off. I walked back to my desk, my blood like ice in my veins. The puzzle was complete. This wasn't a single instance of corruption. It was a business model. Brightspan didn't sell security. It sold silence. It offered its VIP Gold clients a digital black site where their most damning secrets, illegal surveillance, hidden records, incriminating files could be stored off the books, protected by a firewall of corporate power and plausible deniability. My mother's killer wasn't just a client. He was a poster child for their most exclusive and most depraved service. My decision was instantaneous. I was done playing by the rules of a game that was rigged from the start. Reporting Willen would be useless. He would deny everything. The donation would be framed as philanthropy, and the file would disappear forever with a few keystrokes. I wasn't going to be the whistleblower who gets crushed by the system. I was going to be the system's cancer, rotting it from the inside out. I wouldn't just expose Rick. I would expose them all. My focus widened. Rick was the catalyst. but Willen and the entire VIP program were the disease. I had to gather more evidence. I had to prove this was a pattern, not an isolated incident. My work became my cover in a way I had never imagined. The upcoming quarterly data integrity audit that Willen had so helpfully reminded me of was the perfect vehicle. It was my official mandate to poke around in the darkest corners of our network. I created a new, encrypted folder on my secure drive. I began to build a list. I started with the VIP Gold clients, cross-referencing their accounts with the same kinds of server anomalies I had found with Rick's file. I looked for personal video files stored in non-standard directories, audio tracks with deleted segments, and security camera footage from private residences that had convenient glitches or corruptions at specific, incriminating times. The work was sickening. I found a dozen more accounts with similar red flags: a politician with lost hotel security footage, a CEO with a file labeled Nannycam Backup that had been scrubbed of its audio, a financier with a series of recordings from a private yacht, all of which had a mysterious 2-hour gap. I didn't know the specific stories behind these digital ghosts, but I knew what I was looking at. I was looking at a curated library of powerful men's sins, protected and maintained by the company I worked for. I was not the only one whose truth had been buried in Brightspan's servers. There were other victims, other women, other families, whose justice was locked away in these encrypted files. My personal vendetta had blossomed into a crusade. This wasn't just about my mother anymore. It was about all of them. I was no longer just her daughter. I was the unwilling archivist of a secret society of monsters. That night, I stayed late again, the lone fixture in the darkened office. I opened my project folder for the audit. The official title was Q4 2025 Data Integrity Audit Plan. I stared at the words, a monument to corporate euphemism, with a few keystrokes. I created a subfolder, the one where I would store my real findings, the list of names, the file locations, the financial records, and the single, explosive MP4 file that had started it all. This was not an audit. An audit implies a desire to fix the system. I had no such desire. I wanted to burn it to the ground. This was my declaration of war, disguised as a compliance check. This was my audit from hell. The official memo arrived in my inbox on a Monday morning. The subject line was a masterpiece of corporate banality, commencement of Q4 Data Integrity Audit. It was from Mark Willen. The email was brief, outlining the scope of the audit and naming me as the lead analyst, granting me top-tier administrative privileges for the duration of the review. It was exactly what I had been waiting for. Reading his sterile, jargon-filled prose felt like being handed a signed confession. He had given me the keys to his kingdom, believing I was just a janitor coming to sweep the floors, never suspecting I was there to map out its destruction. The audit began. My days became a meticulous performance of my official duties. I ran the standard diagnostic scripts. I generated the expected preliminary reports on server latency and packet loss, and I sat in meetings, nodding thoughtfully while my colleagues discussed firewall optimization. This was my camouflage. The real work began after 5 o'clock, when the office emptied and the quiet hum of the servers became my only companion. The night was my battlefield. My desk a command center in a silent war fought with code and queries. My process was methodical, bordering on obsessive. I was a digital archaeologist, carefully excavating the layers of Brightspan's secrets. I didn't just copy files. I copied the entire digital ecosystem around them. For every illicit video file I found, I also backed up the access logs showing who uploaded it, the server logs showing where it was routed, and the security logs showing who had accessed it since. I cloned entire sections of the server, creating perfect, time-stamped snapshots of the data as it existed in that moment. It was a painstaking, laborious process. Each terabyte of data transferred was another brick in the wall of my case, another nail for their coffins. I was no longer just collecting evidence against Rick. I was documenting a criminal enterprise that hid behind a veil of corporate legitimacy. I knew Willen was watching me. After our tense meeting, I had become a variable he couldn't control. I could feel his digital shadow following me. I'd find traces in the logs, his admin account running a check on my recent activity, querying the directories I had accessed. He was nervous. He was looking for what I was looking for. This gave me an idea. It was one thing to have the data. It was another to prove a conscious, deliberate cover-up. I needed to catch the king in his castle, actively destroying the evidence. Late one night, I wrote a simple, elegant script. It was a watchdog, a silent alarm. I embedded it deep within the server's monitoring protocols, disguised as part of my audit's diagnostic toolkit. The script's function was singular. It would monitor for any high-level administrative actions specifically. A manual file deletion within the legacy server directories where I had found the VIP's dirty laundry. If a file or folder in one of those locations was purged by an admin credential, the script would do two things. First, it would instantly and silently trigger a complete, system-state backup of the targeted sector to a secure, isolated partition that only I knew existed. Second, it would send a single, encrypted character, a simple period to a private, anonymous email address I controlled. It was my tripwire. For a week, nothing happened. I continued my work, my collection of digital sins growing every night. Then, on a Wednesday, just before midnight, my personal phone, which I kept on my desk for just this purpose, vibrated. I glanced at the screen. A new email. The sender was anonymous. The subject line was blank. The body of the message contained only a period. He had taken the bait. I instantly minimized my official work and pulled up my remote server access console. My heart was a cold, steady metronome in my chest. I navigated to the live admin activity log. There it was, in stark, undeniable text. Admin M. Willen initiated manual purge of directory LGCYI SVR 7 cache USRS R. Nolan. The log showed a cascade of file deletions, a digital massacre. He was scrubbing everything connected to Rick Nolan. He was trying to erase him. He was trying to erase me. But as his commands were executing, my own script was working in the background. A silent, invisible counter-operation. It was faster than his deletions. Before his command could wipe a file, my script had already copied it, preserved it, and sealed it away. He thought he was destroying the evidence. In reality, he was creating my most damning exhibit, a time-stamped, irrefutable record of a corporate cover-up, initiated by the Director of Data Integrity himself. I watched the logs until the process was complete. The directory for R. Nolan was now empty. He had officially, according to the server, never existed. The next morning, his assistant summoned me. The walk to his office felt different. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer just his quiet, subordinate analyst. I was the keeper of his secrets. He was sitting behind his large mahogany desk, his back to the panoramic window overlooking the city. He didn't ask me to sit. "Claire," he started, his voice a low, even tone that didn't match the tension in his shoulders. "I've been reviewing your preliminary audit activity. You're spending a lot of time in the legacy server archives. The audit parameters require a full review of all data storage systems, including those scheduled for decommissioning," I said, my voice as calm and toneless as his. He leaned forward, his mask of corporate affability gone. His eyes were cold, hard chips of ice. "Your theoretical vulnerability from the other week. Drop it. The archives are a non-issue. I'm retasking you to focus on the active client-facing servers. Stay in your lane." It was a direct order, a threat, thinly veiled in corporate jargon. He was drawing a line in the sand, daring me to cross it. He thought his late-night purge had removed any leverage I might have had. He had no idea he had just handed me the gun. I held his gaze, and then I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Of course, Mark," I said. "I'm just following the procedure." I saw it then, the flicker of panic in his eyes. He knew that I knew. He had expected fear, or at least obedience. He had not expected calm defiance. He had not expected my smile. He realized, in that moment, that I was not a problem to be managed. I was a threat. The fear radiating from him was a palpable thing, more satisfying than any shouted confession could ever be. I walked back to my desk, my purpose solidified. He had just declared war. It was time to launch my first strike. I spent the next hour composing a message. It was concise, professional, and stripped of all emotion. I attached a single file, the log showing Willen's manual purge, alongside the system state backup my script had taken, proving the files had existed moments before he deleted them. I found the email address of a highly respected former federal prosecutor who now specialized in corporate data crime and whistleblower cases. A woman with a reputation for shredding companies like Brightspan. I sent the email through a secure, encrypted service. With the message sent, a new phase had begun. It was out of my hands now, moving through channels I couldn't control. I felt a strange sense of calm. There was one last thing I needed to do. For myself, I needed to listen to the file one more time. I plugged the encrypted drive into my laptop. My hands were trembling again, not with fear, but with a strange, solemn anticipation. I navigated to the file. My mother's ghost in the machine. I double-clicked. The media player opened. The black screen appeared. Her voice filled my headphones. A ghostly whisper from the past. "Turn off the alerts." My own voice followed, small and distant. This time, I didn't shut it down. I forced myself to listen, to bear witness. I listened to the muffled sound of the phone being put away. Then, there was a stretch of silence, filled only with the sound of rustling fabric and my mother's sharp, terrified breaths. I heard Rick's voice, a low, indistinct rumble from another room, and then, the thud, the choked scream. My body went rigid, every muscle tensing as I relived the horror, but I kept listening. The recording continued. There was the sound of my running footsteps, the brutal, sickening crack as my head hit the wall, and the sound of my body sliding to the floor. Then, more silence. In my memory, this is where it ended. But the file kept playing. The microphone was still active, buried in my mother's pocket as she lay on the floor. After about 30 seconds of near-total silence, a new sound emerged. Footsteps. But they were different from Rick's heavy, clumsy tread. These were lighter, quicker. And then, a new voice, one I had never heard before. It was a man's voice, but it lacked any of Rick's drunken rage. It was cold, calm, and utterly detached. "Is it done?" the voice asked. Rick's voice replied, a slurred, breathless whisper. "She's down. She's not moving." There was a pause, and then the cold voice spoke again. The words delivered with the finality of a death sentence. Words that would forever haunt me. "Good. She won't bother us anymore." The discovery of that second voice changed the war. My mother's death was no longer a domestic tragedy covered up by a corrupt company. It was a conspiracy. The cold, detached tone of that unknown man elevated the crime from a drunken, impulsive act of violence to something premeditated, calculated. He had said, "She won't bother us anymore." Who was us? This recording wasn't just the key to proving Rick's guilt. It was a thread that, if pulled, could unravel something far larger and more sinister. The time for silent, meticulous evidence gathering was over. It was time to set the world on fire. I spent the next 2 hours preparing my arsenal. I was no longer an analyst. I was an information warrior. At my home computer, using a chain of VPNs that bounced my signal across 3 continents and the anonymizing power of the Tor browser. I began to assemble the package. I created a new, untraceable, encrypted email account. The recipient was a journalist at the Ledger Wire, a fiercely independent online publication known for its deep-dive investigative pieces that had toppled 2 senators and a Fortune 500 CEO in the past 5 years. Her name was Alana Jensen, and her digital footprint showed she was relentless. The package I compiled was a masterclass in irrefutable proof. It contained 3 core exhibits. Exhibit A, the original, unedited 4:03 a.m. MP4 file. Exhibit B, an enhanced version of the audio, where I had isolated and amplified the final 30 seconds, transcribing the chilling exchange between Rick and the unknown man. Exhibit C. A compressed folder containing the complete chain of evidence against Brightspan, the log files showing Willen's manual deletion of the R. Nolan directory. The secret backup my script had created proving the file's prior existence, the internal financial records showing Rick's $50,000 donation to Willen's foundation, and the list of a dozen other VIP gold accounts with suspiciously compromised data. I wrote a short, anonymous cover letter, stripped of all emotion. It simply stated Brightspan. Technologies is using its secure data infrastructure to help powerful clients conceal criminal activity. Attached is evidence of one such case, including a recording related to the death of Ellen Nolan Cleveland Pd. Case 774A9, a case that was improperly closed. The recording was stored on an internal Brightspan server, and a subsequent cover-up was initiated by Director Mark Willen. The other files demonstrate this is a systemic practice. Do with this what you will. I hit send, the data packet, a digital bomb containing all my rage and all my proof, shot into the ether. There was no confirmation, no turning back. I shut down my computer, the silence of my small apartment feeling heavy and expectant. I had just lit the fuse. Now all I could do was wait for the explosion. It came at 6:15 the next morning. It didn't start with a bang, but with the familiar vibration of my phone on the nightstand. A news alert. The headline was a jolt of pure adrenaline, a stark, black and white declaration of war that I had only dreamed of seeing. Exclusive Brightspan Technologies. Data security giant. Implicated in cover-up of domestic crimes. Leaked files suggest corporate complicity in client felonies. I clicked the link. Alana Jensen's byline was at the top. She had worked through the night. The article was a devastating surgical takedown. It laid out the evidence piece by piece. It had quotes from data ethics experts, a statement from a former Brightspan engineer about the VIP Gold program, and, most damningly, an embedded audio player. I pressed play, and the sound of my mother's last moments, of that cold, unknown voice, filled my silent apartment. The Ledger Wire hadn't just published the story. They had declared war. I got dressed with a deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness. I chose a simple black dress and tied my hair back. I did not bother with the concealer for my scar. Today, I wanted them to see it. When I walked into the office at 8 o'clock, it was like walking into a morgue where the bodies were still walking and talking. The usual morning buzz was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. People were gathered in small, anxious clumps, staring at their monitors, whispering. No one looked at me, but I could feel their eyes on my back as I walked to my desk. They didn't know I was the cause, but in a company built on secrets, the source of a leak is the ultimate boogeyman. At 8:30, the email landed in every employee's inbox. It was from the CEO, a man named Arthur Vance. The subject was urgent all-hands emergency meeting. Boardroom A, 9:00 a.m. The boardroom was packed. The air was thick with fear. Arthur Vance, a man who usually projected an aura of unflappable, silver-haired authority, looked pale and shaken. Mark Willen stood beside him, his face a mask of furious betrayal. His eyes scanned the crowd and locked on mine. In that moment, he knew. Vance gave a short, panicked speech about unsubstantiated allegations and a malicious, illegal data breach. He promised a full internal investigation. Then he turned the floor over to Willen. "This breach was not a systemic failure," Willen said, his voice tight with rage. "It was a targeted, internal attack. The data logs show that the only person with the access credentials and recent activity in the affected legacy servers was one of our own senior analysts." He turned and pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "Claire Evans." A collective gasp went through the room. Every eye was on me. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I simply held his gaze, my expression a perfect, calm blank. I was escorted from the boardroom by security. Jessica from HR met me at my desk. her usual plastic smile replaced by a look of grave, practiced disappointment. "Claire," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Effective immediately. You are suspended without pay pending the results of the investigation. Please gather your personal belongings." I placed my coffee mug and a small photo of my mother into my bag. As the security guard watched, I slowly, deliberately, smiled. A real smile. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a sharp, dangerous thing. A sliver of ice. Jessica looked startled. They thought this was a punishment. They thought they were silencing me, caging me. They had no idea they had just handed me the one thing I needed most, my freedom. By suspending me, they had nullified my employment contract. They had released me from the ironclad, career-ending non-disclosure agreement I had signed on my first day. They had just given me a voice. I was home by noon. I didn't rest. I opened my personal laptop and bought a domain name. Within an hour, the site was live. It was stark white, with a single line of black text at the top, the file that shouldn't exist. I wrote one post. It wasn't emotional. It was an indictment. I laid out the facts, the timeline, my mother's name, Rick's name, Willen's name. I embedded the audio file, the financial records, the deletion logs. I wrote about the police case being closed, about the system that failed, and about the corporation that profited from it. I ended it with a single, simple sentence. "My name is Claire Nolan, and this is the truth." I hit publish. The internet is a force of nature. Within hours, the link was trending. It was picked up by other news outlets, who now had a name and a face to attach to the Ledger Wire's anonymous leak. My story wasn't just a data breach anymore. It was a human tragedy, a story of a daughter's fight for justice. And then, the most incredible thing happened. A woman from Cleveland commented on the blog, a woman who had dated Rick a decade ago, detailing his history of violence and control. Then a former business partner came forward, describing how Rick had threatened him and his family. My story had opened a floodgate. Other victims, silenced by fear or shame, were finding their voices. Late that afternoon, I received a call from a Detective Miller with the Cleveland Police Department. His voice was somber, respectful. "Ms. Nolan," he said, "in light of new evidence that has come to our attention, we are officially reopening the investigation into the death of your mother, Ellen Nolan." I hung up the phone, a single tear tracing the line of my scar. It was a start. The gears of justice, rusted and ignored for 2 years, were finally beginning to turn. That evening, my phone rang again. It was an unknown number. I answered. The voice on the other end was ragged, raw, and shaking with a fury that was utterly impotent. It was Mark Willen. "You?" he spat, the word a venomous curse. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The stock is down 40%. The board is calling for my head. The feds are probably on their way. You've ruined everything." I stood by my window, looking out at the city lights. Everything he valued, the stock price, his title, the company's reputation, was turning to ash. He was a king who had just watched his kingdom burn to the ground, and he couldn't comprehend that I was the one holding the match. I let his words hang in the air for a moment, savoring the sound of his complete and utter unraveling. Then I spoke, my voice as cold and clear as a winter night. "No, Mark," I said, "I didn't ruin anything. I restored something." I paused, letting him wait for it. "Truth." I ended the call. The storm broke on a Tuesday evening. I was in my apartment, the one place that had become both my sanctuary and my command center, sitting in the dark with the blinds drawn. The only light came from the television screen. Every major news network had preempted their regular programming for a special report. The story was the same on every channel: the Brightspan scandal, my truth. I sat on the floor, my back against the couch, and watched as the private horror of my life was repackaged for public consumption. A news anchor with a somber face and perfectly coiffed hair looked directly into the camera and spoke in a grave tone. "Tonight, we have an exclusive and disturbing look at the audio file at the center of the Brightspan data scandal. A recording that law enforcement sources confirm is now a key piece of evidence in a reopened homicide investigation. A banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. Warning: the following audio may be disturbing to some viewers. My breath caught in my throat. I had listened to the file dozens of times, dissecting it, analyzing it, memorizing every rustle and every pause, but I was not prepared to hear it broadcast to the world, to have my mother's final moments of terror served up between a car commercial and the weather forecast. The screen went black, just as it had on my laptop. For a moment, there was only the sound of static, a digital hiss that felt like the sound of the world holding its breath. And then it began. The muffled sounds, the rustling fabric, and her voice, my mother's voice, a thin, terrified whisper that cut through the sterile silence of the news studio and filled my small apartment. Turn off the alerts. The sound was both intimately familiar and horribly alien. It was the voice that had read me bedtime stories, now a ghost speaking from a digital grave to an audience of millions. I felt a pressure build in my chest, a profound, suffocating weight. This was not the catharsis I had imagined. This was a violation, a necessary one, but a violation nonetheless. Her terror was now public property. The clip played on, including the chilling final words of the unknown man. She won't bother us anymore. The anchor reappeared, his face a mask of professional gravity. And then they showed his picture, Rick Nolan, not the blurry, decade-old photo from the public records, but a recent one, smiling at a corporate golf event. His face was plastered on the screen, the name Rick Nolan in bold white letters beneath it. It was no longer a name I whispered in my nightmares. It was a name being spoken in households across America, a name that was, in an instant, synonymous with monster. I muted the television and opened my laptop. The digital world was a roaring bonfire. My blog, the file that shouldn't exist, had crashed 3 times from the sheer volume of traffic. The comments section was a cascading waterfall of rage, sympathy, and shared stories. I scrolled through them, a detached observer of the emotional shockwave I had triggered. The messages came from everywhere, from mothers, from daughters, from survivors of domestic violence, from tech workers who were disgusted by their industry. They were a vast, anonymous chorus of support. One comment, repeated in various forms by hundreds of people, caught my eye and held it. Justice delayed is still justice. I stared at the words, letting them sink in. For 2 years, I had been utterly alone in my grief and my quest. Now, in a strange and overwhelming way, I wasn't. The world was finally listening. The first domino fell the next morning. I was watching a live news feed when the camera cut to a shaky, handheld shot from a news helicopter. It was a view of a familiar suburban street, my old house, a fleet of police cars, lights flashing silently from above, was parked at the curb. The front door opened, and 2 detectives emerged, flanking a figure who looked smaller and more pathetic than I had ever seen him. Rick Nolan, in sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, was being led in handcuffs to a waiting squad car. Reporters swarmed the scene, shouting questions he didn't answer. He kept his head down, his face a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. This wasn't the raging, indomitable monster from my memories. This was just a weak, broken man, exposed in the harsh light of day. I watched until the car pulled away, taking him to a cage where he belonged. A news alert confirmed the charges a few minutes later: perjury, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and felony assault in connection with the death of Ellen Nolan. The next domino was Brightspan. The financial news channels, which had been tracking the story with morbid glee, became my primary source of satisfaction. They showed the stock ticker, the letters BSPN, in blood red next to a downward-pointing arrow that grew steeper by the hour. Analysts in expensive suits spoke in grim tones about catastrophic brand damage and a complete collapse of consumer trust. The company that sold security and silence was now the poster child for corruption and deceit. Their fortress was crumbling. Its foundations rotted from within. The third domino fell quietly, without the drama of a perp walk or a stock market crash. It came as a simple news bulletin that scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Mark Willen, Director of Data Integrity at Brightspan, has resigned. Effective immediately. I felt a grim, dark satisfaction. Willen, with his condescending smiles and corporate platitudes, the man who had warned me to stay in my lane, had just driven himself off a cliff. He had chosen the wrong side. He had protected the wrong person. My phone had become a useless, incessantly ringing brick. Journalists from every major outlet were trying to get a quote, an interview, an exclusive. I ignored them all. My story was in the evidence I had released, not in any soundbite I could give them, but one number, a local San Jose number, was persistent. On the 10th call, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I answered. The voice was young, female, and respectful. Ms. Nolan. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm a reporter with the local affiliate. I know you're not giving interviews, but I just have to ask, after everything you've been through, after everything you've done, do you have anything you'd like to say? I looked at the small, framed photo of my mother I'd taken from my desk. Her smile was bright. From a time before him, a time before everything, what was there to say? The entire world was talking about data and corporations and crime, but for me, it had only ever been about one thing. Yes, I said, my voice quiet but clear. The system is designed to be forgetful. It forgets names. It forgets facts. It forgets people. The system forgot my mother. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I reminded it. I hung up before she could respond. The quote, of course, was on the evening news an hour later. It became the defining statement of the scandal, the tagline for my war. It also cemented a new identity for me in the public eye. They started calling me a whistleblower, a hero, a data activist. They used my name, Claire Nolan, as a symbol for fighting back against corporate power and a broken justice system. I appreciated the sentiment, but the labels felt hollow, like clothes that didn't fit. I hadn't set out to be a symbol. I hadn't done this for a cause or a movement. My motives were far simpler, far more selfish, and far more pure. I had done it all for her. The world could call me a whistleblower, but when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a hero. I saw a scar on my cheek, my mother's eyes staring back at me, and a promise that had finally been kept. I was, and always would be, simply her daughter. 3 weeks, a strange, disorienting pocket of time. The hurricane of the initial expose had passed, leaving behind a landscape of wreckage I could now survey with a quiet, detached calm. The initial media storm, with its ravenous appetite for soundbites and headlines, had moved on to the next scandal. What remained was the slow, grinding machinery of consequence. Rick was in a county jail, denied bail, his name a national byword for monstrous hypocrisy. Mark Willen had vanished from public life, his digital footprint all but erased, a ghost in the corporate machine he once commanded. Brightspan was in freefall, hemorrhaging clients and facing a tidal wave of federal investigations and class action lawsuits. My life had found a new, surreal rhythm. I was no longer Claire Nolan, the avenging daughter, or Claire Evans, the anonymous analyst. I was a paradox, a recluse whose name was known by millions. My days were quiet. I read, I walked through the park, my face hidden by sunglasses and a hat. I drank coffee and watched the world go by from my apartment window. The roar of the battle had been replaced by a profound, almost unnerving, silence. The letter arrived on a Friday. It came not by regular mail, but by a bonded courier. A man in a crisp uniform who required my signature on a digital tablet. The envelope was heavy, made of thick, creamy cardstock, the kind reserved for wedding invitations or declarations of war. In the top left corner, embossed in a deep, corporate blue, was the Brightspan Technologies logo. I took it inside and slid it open with a kitchen knife. The letterhead was the same, but the signature at the bottom was new. Arthur Vance, the The CEO, who had looked so shaken in that emergency all-hands meeting, had been ousted by the board. The new signature belonged to a name I didn't recognize, Eleanor Vance. No relation. A corporate turnaround specialist brought in to salvage the sinking ship. The letter was a masterwork of legal and corporate sophistry. It began with an apology, not for their actions, but for the recent turmoil and the unfortunate position in which you were placed. It was the kind of apology that doesn't admit fault, like saying you're sorry someone else got caught in the rain you caused. It went on to praise my unwavering commitment to the foundational principles of data integrity. It reframed my leak, my act of war, as an unorthodox but ultimately effective internal audit procedure. They were trying to rewrite history, to co-opt my rebellion and rebrand it as a heroic act of corporate self-correction that I had bravely initiated on their behalf. And then came the offer. They were formally rescinding my suspension. Furthermore, they were delighted to invite me back to my position as senior analyst. But not just that, they were offering me a promotion to a newly created role, Vice President of Ethical Compliance. The position came with a 60% salary increase and a substantial signing bonus, a figure with enough zeros to be life-changing. The final paragraph was the most audacious. It offered this obscene amount of money and power as a token of their gratitude for my profound loyalty and unwavering perseverance in the face of significant internal challenges. I read that last line twice. Loyalty and perseverance. The words hung in the air. So utterly devoid of meaning they were almost comical. I let the letter fall onto the table. A laugh escaped my lips. It wasn't a sound of joy or amusement. It was a short, sharp, brittle thing, like the snapping of a dead twig. Loyalty, I whispered to the empty room. Loyalty to whom? To the men who protected my mother's killer. To the system that sold silence as a service. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. They weren't offering me a job. They were trying to buy my silence. They wanted to put me on the payroll, wrap me in the golden chains of a C-suite title, and turn their greatest liability into a PR asset. Look, they could say, "We are the company that listens. We promote our whistleblowers. We are the good guys now." They thought my war had a price tag. They thought my integrity could be purchased. I walked over to my printer, a device I hadn't used in months. I placed the letter on the scanner bed and made a single, high-quality copy. The machine hummed, its quiet whir the only sound in the room. I took the original, the expensive, heavy cardstock with its embossed logo, and folded it twice, creasing it sharply with my thumbnail. I walked into the kitchen, placed the folded letter on the small table by the window, and set my half-full coffee mug directly on top of it. A dark, wet ring immediately began to bleed into the paper, warping the CEO's pristine signature into a blurry brown smudge. It was the most fitting tribute I could imagine. For the rest of the day, I left it there, a monument to their desperation. The call came the following Monday. The caller ID showed the main number for Brightspan headquarters. I let it ring 4 times, then answered, putting the phone on speaker. Claire Evans, the voice was strained, overly bright. It was Jessica from HR, the woman who had advised me to cultivate a more positive attitude, who had watched with practiced sympathy as I was marched out of the building by security. "This is she," I said, my voice flat. "Oh, wonderful. We were so hoping to hear from you," she gushed, the relief in her voice palpable. "Did you receive the package we sent over on Friday?" The letter, "Yes, I received it." "Excellent. The board is incredibly enthusiastic about the new role. They feel you are uniquely positioned to help us chart a new course, to rebuild, to heal. We'd love to have you in this week to discuss the next steps." I looked at the coffee-stained letter on my table. I thought about the men whose lives were now in ruins, the families who were now getting a second chance at justice, and the woman whose voice was the ghost in my heart. They wanted me to come back and help them heal. They wanted me to put a bandage on the mortal wound I had inflicted. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to wait. I could hear her breathing on the other end, a shallow, anxious sound. "Claire, are you there?" "I'm here. Jessica," I said, my voice dropping to a low, quiet register. I've considered your offer. I paused, and I have to say, you made a terrible mistake 3 weeks ago. A mistake, she asked, her voice faltering. I don't understand. I picked up the coffee mug, leaving the stained, ruined letter behind. You shouldn't have suspended me, I said, the words as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. You fired the wrong woman. I hung up. I did not slam the phone down. I simply pressed the end call button on the screen and placed the phone back on the counter. The silence that followed was absolute. A strange, unfamiliar feeling settled over me. It wasn't the triumphant joy of victory. It wasn't the fiery satisfaction of revenge. It was peace, a deep, quiet, profound sense of stillness. The war was truly over. The last shot had been fired, and it had been a refusal. My power wasn't in accepting their money or their title. My power was in my ability to say no, to deny them the one thing they needed most, my forgiveness, my validation. I knew, in that moment, that the only true justice, the only real apology, was the one they had just tried to offer me, a desperate, pathetic plea from a position of utter weakness. It was the sound of a crumbling empire, begging for mercy from the ghost who had brought it to its knees. That night, for the first time in a long time, the memories came without the sharp, stabbing pain. I thought of my mother's voice, the phrase that had been both my curse and my catalyst. Turn off alerts. Her plea to be silent, to be invisible, to survive. It had been her strategy, the only one she had. I stood in the darkness of my living room, looking out at the endless grid of city lights, each one a small, blinking notification in the vastness of the night. I whispered back to her, a new vow spoken into the quiet dark. No, Mom. A small, sad smile touched my lips. I'm turning them all on. The chamber was a cavern of polished wood and hushed reverence, a cathedral built to the god of law. It was cold, the air conditioned to a precise, inorganic chill that did nothing to stop the sweat from beading on the brows of the men under the hot, white glare of the television lights. I sat at a long, imposing table, a single microphone before me, a glass of water untouched at my right hand. I was a witness, a name on a docket, but I knew what I really was. I was the ghost at the feast. Across the room, at another table reserved for the corporate representatives, sat Mark Willen. He was not the same man who had threatened me in his office. The bespoke suit was still immaculate, the haircut still sharp, but the man inside was a ruin. His face was a pale, doughy mask of exhaustion. His eyes, which had once been cold and dismissive, were now perpetually darting, unable to land on any one thing for more than a second. They never landed on me. He had been meticulously avoiding my gaze since he'd been sworn in an hour ago. He sat flanked by a team of lawyers whose grim, expensive faces promised nothing but damage control. They were not here to win. They were here to negotiate the terms of their surrender. The Senate Subcommittee on Commerce, Science, and Data Security was in session. The senators, a row of stern, impassive faces on the raised dais, had been grilling Brightspan's new CEO, Eleanor Vance, for the better part of the morning. She was good. She was a professional crisis manager, speaking in a calm, measured tone about a new era of transparency and a regrettable but isolated failure of oversight. She used words like reevaluating protocols and robust internal reforms. She was trying to frame the company as the victim of a few bad apples. The senators, for their part, were playing their roles, feigning outrage for the cameras, speaking in booming, theatrical tones about the sacred trust of the American consumer. It was all a performance, a carefully choreographed dance of accountability that wasn't meant to solve anything, only to be seen. Finally, the chairman, a silver-haired senator from Vermont, with a reputation for being a bulldog, turned his attention to me. The cameras swiveled in my direction. I could feel the heat of their lights on my face, a sterile, artificial sun. The committee will now call Ms. Claire Nolan, he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. Ms. Nolan, thank you for being here. We know this is not an easy process. I leaned into the microphone. Thank you for the invitation. Senator. My voice was clear and steady, betraying none of the cold fire burning in my chest. The senator shuffled some papers. Ms. Nolan, you were a senior data analyst at Brightspan Technologies. You are, in fact, the individual who brought these disturbing practices to light. Let's be direct. For the record, is it true that your former company, Brightspan, knowingly used its proprietary data servers to store and conceal illicit personal video and audio files for its high-paying clients? The question hung in the air, a perfect softball pitch waiting to be hit. The lawyers at Willen's table tensed. Eleanor Vance's calm expression tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. They expected a simple yes. They expected me to fall in line, to be their star witness in their carefully managed narrative of redemption. I looked from the senator to the row of cameras, and then I let my eyes drift across the room and land, for the very first time, on Mark Willen. I held his gaze. He flinched, a small, almost invisible spasm, but I saw it. His eyes darted away, down to the polished surface of his table. I leaned back into the microphone. My voice was quiet, but in the amplified silence of the chamber, it carried the weight of a hammer blow. Senator, I said, my words slow and deliberate, you asked if my company stored illegal footage. I paused, letting the distinction sink in. It is not my company. It is theirs. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. One of Willen's lawyers leaned over and whispered something urgent in his ear, but Willen just continued to stare at the table, his face ashen. The chairman's eyebrows raised slightly. He had not expected the correction. He had not expected the open declaration of war. A fine point? Ms. Nolan, he said, recovering quickly. Can you provide this committee with a specific example of the kind of material that their company was concealing? This was the moment. I reached into my bag and retrieved the small, encrypted flash drive. It looked so insignificant, a tiny piece of black plastic, but I knew it was a key, a weapon, a tombstone. I leaned forward and placed it on the table. I can do better than that. Senator, I said, with your permission, I can show you. The chairman conferred briefly with his aide. He looked out at the press gallery, at the hungry, waiting cameras. He knew a good show when he saw one. He nodded. Permission granted. An attendant came forward and took the drive, plugging it into a laptop connected to the large projector screens that flanked the dais. My own laptop screen flickered to life in front of me, showing the drive's contents a single file, 4:03 a.m., MP4. I moved the mouse, my hand as steady as a rock, and double-clicked. The massive screens in the chamber, previously showing the Senate seal, went black. The room, which had been filled with a low murmur, fell utterly, completely silent. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just the vast, empty blackness, a visual representation of the void my mother had left behind. And then, her voice. Turn off the alerts. The sound, a terrified, disembodied whisper, filled the cavernous chamber. It was no longer a ghost in my headphones. It was a public record, a testament echoing off the marble and wood of the nation's capital. I heard a collective, sharp intake of breath from the gallery. I saw the senators on the dais lean forward, their masks of political theater replaced by expressions of genuine, human shock. The audio played on. My own tinny voice, the rustling, the muffled sounds, the thud, the choked, half-swallowed scream. I did not watch the screen. I watched him, Mark Willen. He sat frozen at his table, his head bowed, his shoulders hunched. He looked like a man being publicly stoned. He refused to look up. He was staring at his hands, which were clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table in front of him. The recording continued, playing the sounds of my assault, the sickening crack, the silence, and then the final, damning exchange. Is it done? She's down. She's not moving. Good. She won't bother us anymore. When the recording ended, the silence it left behind was heavier, more profound than before. No one spoke. No one coughed. The only sound was the faint, almost imperceptible whir of the cameras. In that moment, the hearing was no longer about data protocols or corporate malfeasance. It was about a woman's last moments, played out for the world to hear. It was about the cold, casual cruelty of the men who had orchestrated her end. I did not cry. I did not show any emotion at all. My face was a mask of cold, hard placidity. My entire being was focused on one single point, the bowed head of the man across the room. I stared at him, my gaze a physical force, boring into the top of his skull. I willed him to look at me, to face me, to acknowledge the ruin he had helped create. He couldn't. He slowly, deliberately, brought a hand to his face, covering his eyes as if the light from the cameras had become physically painful. It was a gesture of complete and utter defeat, a white flag raised in a battle he had lost before he had even walked into the room. The chairman finally cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "Ms. Nolan," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't quite conceal. "On behalf of this committee, we thank you for your testimony." The bang of his gavel was the signal. The hearing was over. The spell was broken. The room erupted into a cacophony of sound reporters shouting questions, aides rushing, lawyers packing their briefcases. I remained seated, a small, still island in the chaotic sea. Finally, I stood up. I gathered my things, leaving the flash drive on the table. It was their evidence now. As I turned to leave, walking down the center aisle toward the large doors at the back of the chamber, the noise seemed to fade away. It was as if I were encased in a bubble of silence. Just as I reached the exit, a sound cut through the din. It was sharp, distinct, and achingly familiar. A digital chime, an alert. It came from a reporter's phone in the front row. A notification for a breaking news story. A story that was, in all likelihood, about the very hearing I was now leaving. It was the last one, the final notification in a war that had started with a whispered plea to turn them all off. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and walked out into the bright, indifferent light of the afternoon, leaving the ghosts and their judgment behind me. The flight back from DRC was a blur of anonymous airports and the low vibrational hum of the jet engines. I did not watch the news on the seatback screen. I did not read the articles about the hearing that were already flooding the internet. I did not listen to the voicemails from lawyers and publishers and producers that were rapidly filling my phone's memory. I simply sat, a ghost in seat 14A, and watched the clouds drift by below. A vast, white, silent ocean. The world was loud, but I had finally found a pocket of stillness within the storm, and I guarded it fiercely. My apartment was exactly as I had left it, a quiet, orderly space that felt like it belonged to a stranger. The air was cool and still. The late afternoon sun cast long, dusty shadows across the floor. For 2 years, this place had been a bunker, a command center, a prison cell. Now, it just felt like a room, an empty room waiting for a new life to begin within its walls. I didn't unpack my bag. I didn't check my mail. I walked directly to the small desk in the corner of the living room and sat down. I opened my laptop. The machine whirred to life, the screen illuminating my face in its cool blue-white light. The last program I had used was still open, exactly as I had left it before my trip to Washington. The media player, the black rectangle, sat in the center of my screen. The progress bar, a thin white line, paused roughly 2/3 of the way through. The timestamp read 0:01:14. 4:03 a.m., MP4. The file, the ghost, the weapon. For 24 months, this small collection of megabytes had been the central, organizing principle of my entire existence. It was the source of my nightmares and the engine of my revenge. It was my mother's last will and testament, a poison pill I had carried, waiting for the right moment to use. I had listened to it, analyzed it, weaponized it, and finally, unleashed it upon the world. Now, it just sat there, a silent, waiting thing. My hand went to the mouse. I moved the cursor, letting it hover over the play button. I could listen one last time. I could hear her voice again. I could hear the proof, the horror, the entire justification for the war I had waged. But I realized, with a sudden, profound clarity, that I no longer needed to. The world had heard it. The senators had heard it. He had heard it. Its purpose was served. Its power was spent. It was no longer a weapon. It was just a scar. And you don't have to keep touching a scar to know it's there. My finger moved from the left mouse button to the right. A small drop-down menu appeared. A list of mundane options: open, play, add to playlist, properties, and at the bottom of the list, a single, simple word: delete. My cursor moved until it rested on that word, for 2 years. My hands had trembled at the thought of this file, at the memory of that night. A fine, persistent tremor that was a constant, physical reminder of my trauma. But now, as my index finger rested on the button, my hand was perfectly, completely still. There was no hesitation, no fear, no second thoughts. There was only a quiet, resolute finality. I clicked. A small box appeared in the center of the screen. A final, digital gatekeeper. Are you sure you want to permanently delete this file? This file was my mother's voice. It was the last piece of her I had left in the world. Deleting it felt like a second burial, a final letting go, but holding on to it, I knew, would keep me tethered to the past, a ghost haunting the ruins of my own life. It was a relic of the war, and the war was over. I moved the cursor to the yes button and clicked again. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a small notification slid into the bottom right corner of the screen. A quiet, unobtrusive little banner. File permanently removed. And just like that, it was gone. The media player closed. My desktop background, a generic, calming image of a misty forest, reappeared. It was as if the file had never existed. The ghost had been exorcised. I leaned back in my chair, the tension draining out of my shoulders, a knot I hadn't even realized I was carrying for 2 years finally coming undone. I looked at the small, framed photo on my desk, the one of her smiling in the summer sun. I whispered the words into the silent room, a final report to my commanding officer. It's over, Mom. I don't know how long I sat there. The sun went down, and the city lights began to glitter to life outside my window, a sprawling galaxy of other people's lives. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I felt no satisfaction. I simply felt quiet. The roaring fire of my rage had burned down to embers, leaving behind not emptiness, but a clean, calm, open space. Eventually, I stood up and walked to the window. In the distance, the first hints of dawn were beginning to streak the eastern sky, a faint, gray-blue line separating the darkness from the coming day. I glanced at the digital clock on the cable box. The glowing red numbers read 4:03 a.m. The exact time. The beginning, the end. A quiet, cosmic coincidence that felt like a final, gentle nod from the universe, a bookend to the longest night of my life. I turned away from the window. I walked to my bedroom, the first light of the new day at my back. I did not bother to draw the curtains. I pulled back the covers and lay down, the cool sheets a welcome comfort. I closed my eyes. There was no music, there were no tears. There was only the profound, deep, and dreamless silence of a war finally won. And for the first time since that night, I slept. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and where you're listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video. And if you want to help this story reach more people, please consider hitting the hype button to give it an extra boost.